The dust devils spun like dervishes across the cracked earth, mocking Caleb's thirst. He squinted, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana already stiff with grime. He'd been tracking stray cattle for 3 days, the endless horizon blurring into a shimmering haze. That's when he saw them, the buzzards. Not just one or two, but a dark, swirling mass against the bleached sky, their lazy circles tightening with a morbid patience. Caleb spurred his horse, roan, toward the gathering scavengers. He knew what buzzards meant in this land. Death, or something close to it. The stench hit him before he saw the source, a cloying metallic tang that made his stomach churn. He found them huddled near the dry creek bed. 2 young girls, maybe 8 and 10 years old. Apache, by their dress, what little remained of it. Their hands were bound tight with rawhide, the ropes cutting into their wrists. Their faces, streaked with dirt and tears, were turned toward the unforgiving sun. Caleb dismounted, roan shifting nervously. The buzzards hopped back a few feet, their beady eyes fixed on the girls. He drew his knife, the steel glinting in the harsh light. As he worked to cut the ropes, the younger girl whimpered, shrinking back as if he were another threat. He remembered his own daughter, Sarah, gone now, taken by fever years ago. The memory was a raw wound, a constant ache in his chest. He saw Sarah in the younger girl's frightened eyes. He finished cutting the ropes, the rawhide falling away like shed skin. The older girl, her face stoic, watched him with suspicion. He offered them his canteen. They hesitated. Then the younger one reached for it, her small hand trembling. She drank deeply, then passed it to her sister. He didn't speak, didn't know their language, didn't need to. Their fear was a language he understood. He knew what it meant to be lost, alone, abandoned in this brutal land. He knew the gnawing hunger, the desperate thirst, the chilling fear that clung to you like a shroud. The sun beat down, relentless and unforgiving. The buzzards circled. Caleb knew he couldn't leave them here. Not to the sun, not to the scavengers, not to whatever fate had brought them to this desolate place. He had no plan, no destination in mind. Just a deep, unwavering certainty that he couldn't turn his back. He lifted the younger girl onto Rowan, then helped the older one mount behind her. He took the reins, and with a low whistle, Rowan started walking west, towards a sliver of hope on the horizon. Rowan plodded onward, each step kicking up puffs of dust that hung in the air like ghosts. Caleb walked beside them, leading the horse. The younger girl, her name he later learned was Kaya, clung to her older sister, Nani. Nani's gaze, still guarded, flicked between the horizon and Caleb's weathered face. He felt the weight of their fear, a palpable thing in the dry air. He cleared his throat, the sound rough against the silence. "Water," he rasped, pointing to the canteen hanging from Rowan's saddle horn. He repeated the word in a clumsy, fractured Apache he'd picked up trading hides years ago. Kaya flinched, but Nani understood, her eyes widening slightly. Caleb was a man carved from the land itself, all harsh angles and sun-baked skin. Years of solitude had etched deep lines around his eyes, a testament to the hardships he'd endured. He wasn't a talker. Words were precious, to be used sparingly. Actions spoke louder, especially in this unforgiving country. He thought about the authorities. Fort Smith was the closest, days away. Turning the girls over seemed the logical thing, the responsible thing, but the thought soured in his gut. He remembered his own father, wrongly accused of cattle rustling, the injustice burning in his memory like a brand. The law wasn't always blind. Sometimes it just didn't care, especially when it came to Indians. He looked at Kaya, her face smudged with dirt, her eyes mirroring the vast, empty landscape. He couldn't hand them over, not knowing what awaited them. He owed them more than that. He owed Sarah more than that. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood red. They needed shelter. He scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of cover. A cluster of rocks, maybe. A shallow cave. Anything to break the wind and offer a sliver of protection from the night's chill. He pointed towards a distant ridge, barely visible in the fading light. "Camp," he grunted, hoping Nani understood. He pulled Rowan to a halt, unsaddling him and hobbling his front legs. He rummaged through his saddlebags, pulling out a worn blanket and a small pouch of dried meat. He offered the meat to the girls, gesturing for them to eat. Nani hesitated, then took a piece, tearing off a small portion and giving it to Kaya. They ate in silence, their eyes fixed on the ground. Caleb watched them, his heart aching with a familiar sadness. He didn't know where he was going or what he was going to do, but he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would protect these girls. He was their only hope in this desolate land. The desert stretched before them, an uncertain path leading into the unknown. The ridge loomed closer, revealing itself not as a natural formation, but the skeletal remains of a town. Buildings stood like hollow-eyed skulls, their windows gaping black holes, staring out at the endless plains. Dust devils danced through the deserted streets, whispering forgotten names. Caleb led Rowan into the ghost town, the horses' hooves echoing eerily against the cracked earth. Nani and Kaya clung to each other, their eyes wide with apprehension. The silence was thick, broken only by the creak of wind-battered signs and the mournful cry of a distant coyote. He found a relatively intact building, a former saloon, judging by the faded sign hanging crookedly above the doorway. The roof had partially collapsed, letting in streaks of moonlight, but the walls offered some protection from the elements. He helped the girls dismount, their small bodies stiff and sore. Inside, the saloon was a jumble of broken furniture and debris. Caleb cleared a small space near the back wall, spreading the blanket on the floor. He gestured for the girls to sit. He then pulled out a small tin box from his saddlebags, containing a salve and strips of clean cloth. He knelt beside Kaya, gently examining her wrists. The rawhide had left deep welts, the skin raw and inflamed. Kaya flinched as he touched her, but she didn't cry out. Nani watched him intently, her expression unreadable. Caleb carefully applied the salve, his touch gentle despite his calloused hands. He bandaged Kaya's wrists, then turned his attention to Nani. As he lifted her sleeve, he saw them, a network of scars crisscrossing her upper arm and shoulder. Scars that spoke of burns, of whippings, of a violence that made his blood run cold. He didn't ask. He didn't need to. The scars told their own story, a brutal tale etched onto her skin. He cleaned the wounds with water from his canteen, then applied the salve, his movements deliberate and careful. A flicker of memory, unwelcome and sharp, pierced his consciousness. He saw his own wife, Martha, lying broken and lifeless on the floor of their cabin. Sarah, his daughter, screaming in terror before the renegades, fueled by whiskey and hate, silenced her forever. the flames licking at the log walls, turning his home into a funeral pyre. He squeezed his eyes shut, fighting back the wave of grief and rage. He hadn't spoken of it in years, buried it deep, along with the bodies. But the memory, like a festering wound, refused to heal. It was the reason he wandered, alone and restless, across this desolate land. The reason he couldn't turn his back on these girls. He finished tending to Nani's wounds, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at the girls, their faces pale and drawn in the flickering moonlight. They were survivors like him, marked by the cruelty of this land, but not broken. Not yet. The silence of the ghost town pressed in on them, amplifying the unspoken trauma. Each creak of the wind, each rustle of leaves sounded like a whispered threat. Caleb knew they weren't safe here. But for now, it was shelter, a temporary respite from the harsh realities of the world outside. He banked the small fire he'd built, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He sat watch, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness. He wouldn't let them be hurt again. Not if he could help it. The ghosts of the town seemed to watch with him, silent witnesses to a tragedy that echoed through the years. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in soft hues of pink and gold, but Caleb saw no beauty in it. He was already awake, his senses honed, his body coiled with a quiet tension. He'd slept little, his mind replaying the images of Martha and Sarah, the memory a cold knot in his stomach. He rose silently, careful not to disturb the girls. Nani and Kaya were still asleep, huddled together under the blanket. He stepped outside, the cool morning air a welcome balm against his skin. Rowan whinnied softly, nudging him for attention. Caleb scratched the horse behind the ears, a silent acknowledgement. He needed to hunt. The dried meat wouldn't last long. More importantly, he needed to assess their surroundings, to see if they'd been followed. He grabbed his rifle and a small skinning knife, leaving the ghost town behind him. He moved with a practiced ease, his boots making barely a sound on the dusty ground. Years of tracking and scouting had taught him to read the land like a book. He followed the game trails, his eyes scanning the horizon, alert for any sign of danger. He found a rabbit, caught in a snare. He dispatched it quickly, efficiently, his movements economical. As he turned to head back to the town, he saw them. Tracks, wagon tracks, fresh and distinct, cutting across the game trails. They weren't the tracks of homesteaders. These were heavier, deeper, made by a wagon carrying a substantial load, and they were heading in the direction of the ghost town. His blood ran cold. He crouched down, examining the tracks more closely. The tread pattern was unfamiliar, the wheels wider than those of a common farm wagon. He saw the faint imprints of shod horses, several of them, pulling the wagon. These weren't casual travelers. He straightened up, his mind racing. The men who'd bound Nani and Kaya. They were coming back. He didn't know why, didn't know what they wanted. But he knew they meant trouble. His past, a life he'd tried to bury, rose to the surface. Before the homestead, before Martha and Sarah, he'd been a scout for the army. He knew how to read sign, how to track, how to fight. Skills he thought he'd left behind, now resurrected by necessity. He had to protect the girls. He couldn't let them fall back into the hands of those men. He had to prepare. He ran back to the ghost town, his heart pounding. He found Nani awake, tending to Kaya. She looked up as he approached, her eyes questioning. He didn't speak. He didn't have time. He grabbed his shovel, the one he used to bury his wife and daughter, and began to dig. He needed cover, a place to defend. He pointed to the saloon, then to the ground. Nani understood. Her expression hardened. Her eyes filled with a grim determination. The fragile peace they'd found in the ghost town was shattered. The encroaching tracks represented a danger that threatened to engulf them all. Caleb knew, with a chilling certainty, that a reckoning was coming. Caleb dug with a fury, born of desperation, the shovel biting into the hard-packed earth. He needed a trench, a shallow one, but deep enough to offer some protection. Nani watched him, her face etched with concern. Kaya, still clutching her bandaged wrists, sat quietly near the ruined saloon, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon. He paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at Nani. "Inside," he grunted, gesturing towards the saloon. "Safe." She nodded, understanding. He returned to digging, the rhythm of the shovel a steady counterpoint to the rising tension in the air. He glanced at Kaya. She was small, fragile, but there was a strength in her eyes, a resilience that belied her age. He remembered Sarah, his own daughter, her laughter echoing in his memory. Suddenly, Kaya approached him, her steps hesitant. She held something out to him, her small hand trembling. It was a doll, crudely fashioned from scraps of cloth and twigs. Its button eyes stared blankly ahead, its stitched mouth a silent smile. He took the doll, his calloused fingers dwarfing the tiny object. He looked at Kaya, his eyes questioning. She didn't speak, but her gaze held a depth of emotion that transcended words. It was an offering, a gesture of trust. He squatted down, meeting her gaze. He gently took her hand, his touch surprisingly soft. "Thank you," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. He placed the doll carefully on a nearby rock, a silent guardian. Nani watched the exchange, her expression softening. She stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "Luna," she said, pointing to Kaya. "Her name is Luna. I am Estella." Caleb nodded, acknowledging her words. Luna, Estella, names that carried the weight of their history, their pain. He turned back to his digging, the weight of their trust heavy on his shoulders. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the ghost town, he finished the trench. It wasn't much, but it was something. A barrier, a line in the sand. He sat down beside the trench, his rifle resting across his lap. He looked at the girls, huddled together near the saloon. Estella, still withdrawn and guarded, her eyes darting nervously. Luna, her gaze fixed on him, her small face filled with a quiet hope. He cleared his throat, the sound rough against the silence. He wanted to say something, to offer them some comfort, but words failed him. He looked out at the vast, empty landscape, the rolling hills stretching to the horizon. He pointed to a distant mountain, its peak shrouded in mist. "Sacred," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Apache. Call it Tegaichi, Red Mountain." He paused, searching for the right words. "Stories live in the land. Always stories." He told them stories of the land, of the Apache people who had roamed these hills for centuries. Stories of courage, of resilience, of survival. He told them of the animals that roamed the plains, the birds that soared through the sky. He spoke of the changing seasons, the cycles of life and death. He didn't sugarcoat the truth. He told them of the hardships, the struggles, the violence that had marked this land. But he also spoke of the beauty, the freedom, the enduring spirit that had drawn people to this place. As he spoke, he saw a flicker of light in Estella's eyes, a spark of curiosity. Luna listened intently, her gaze never leaving his face. The stories, like a balm, seemed to soothe their fears, to ease their pain. Caleb knew they couldn't stay in the ghost town. It was a trap, a monument to past failures. He needed water and a place to lay low, a place where he could see anyone coming. He rose, his joints protesting with a familiar ache. "Come," he said, his voice barely audible. "Water." He led them away from the crumbling buildings, towards a break in the hills he'd noticed earlier. Rowan followed, his hooves kicking up dust. Estella and Luna trailed behind, their faces etched with a mixture of apprehension and trust. The break in the hills opened into a narrow canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side. The air grew cooler, the silence deeper. Then he heard it, the faint murmur of water. He quickened his pace, his heart lifting slightly. The canyon opened into a small clearing, and there it was, a river, clear and cold, flowing between moss-covered rocks. Willows lined the banks, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. It was an oasis, a hidden sanctuary in the harsh landscape. He let Rowan drink, then turned to the girls. "Drink," he urged, gesturing to the river. Estella hesitated, then knelt cautiously, cupping her hands and bringing the water to her lips. Luna followed, her eyes wide with wonder. As they drank, Luna looked up at him, her gaze searching. "Bandits," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the water. "They came to our village, burned everything." Estella flinched, her eyes welling with tears. She reached out and took Luna's hand, squeezing it tightly. Caleb knelt beside them, his expression grim. He didn't press them, didn't ask for details. He knew the stories would come in their own time, if they were meant to be told. Luna continued, her voice trembling. "Mama, Papa, gone." She looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with a pain that mirrored his own. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his calloused hand, surprisingly tender. He knew that pain, that emptiness. He carried it with him, every day. He looked at the river, the water flowing endlessly onward. He saw his own reflection in the dark surface, a weathered face etched with grief and regret. He remembered Martha, her laughter, her warmth. He remembered Sarah, her bright eyes, her innocent smile. He remembered digging their graves, the earth cold and unforgiving. He closed his eyes, fighting back the tears. He hadn't cried since that day. He wouldn't cry now, but he could share his story, his burden. He took a deep breath, his voice raspy. "Lost my family," he said, his gaze fixed on the river. "Fire took them. Nothing left." He paused, struggling to find the words. "Buried them by the creek. Still hear their voices, sometimes." He looked at Estella and Luna, their faces pale and drawn. He saw a flicker of understanding in their eyes, a shared recognition of loss. He stood up, his movement stiff. He pointed to a flat rock near the riverbank. "Rest," he said. "Safe, here, for now." He walked away, giving them space. He needed to be alone, to process the memories that had resurfaced. He walked to the edge of the clearing, his rifle resting across his shoulder. He looked out at the canyon, the walls rising like ancient sentinels. The river flowed onward, a constant reminder of the passage of time, of the inevitability of change. He knew he couldn't bring back the past. He couldn't erase the pain. But he could protect these. Caleb watched the canyon walls, the silence amplifying the pounding of his own heart. He knew, safe, here, for now, was a fool's promise in this land. Safety was a fleeting illusion, a whisper on the wind. He scanned the horizon, his senses straining for any sign, any movement. Then he saw them. Riders. 4 of them, silhouetted against the setting sun, their horses kicking up dust as they approached the canyon entrance. The lead rider was larger, broader than the rest, his posture radiating a coiled menace. He recognized the wagon tracks, the distinctive tread pattern. They were back. He felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had hoped they would give up, move on. But hope was a luxury he couldn't afford. He turned back to the clearing, his face grim. Estella and Luna were huddled together near the rock, their eyes wide with fear. They had seen them too. He moved quickly, his actions precise and economical. He grabbed his rifle, checked the load, and then motioned for Estella and Luna to follow him. Behind, rocks, he grunted, pointing to a cluster of boulders near the riverbank. He positioned them behind the largest boulder, offering them what little protection it afforded. He crouched beside them, his rifle ready. "Stay. Quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, matter what." He moved out from behind the rocks, his figure exposed. He wanted them to see him, to know he was waiting. He stood his ground, his stance unwavering, his eyes fixed on the approaching riders. They rode into the clearing, their horses snorting and stamping. The lead rider dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a large man with a thick beard and eyes as cold as glacial ice. He wore a long duster coat, concealing the weapons beneath. "Well, well," the man drawled, his voice a low rumble. "Looks like we found ourselves a little nest of vipers." He spat on the ground, his eyes sweeping over the clearing. "Where are they, old man?" Caleb didn't respond. He remained silent, his gaze unwavering. The man chuckled, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "Don't play coy with me. I know they're here. The girls. We aim to collect what we're owed." He gestured to his companions, who dismounted and spread out, their rifles drawn. "Those girls ain't yours to collect," Caleb finally said, his voice low and gravelly. The man laughed again. "Everything's for sale in this world, old man, especially orphans. Now, are you going to hand them over, or are we going to have to do this the hard way?" Caleb tightened his grip on his rifle. "You'll have to kill me first." The man's eyes narrowed. "That can be arranged. Name's Hawkins, and you just made a mistake, old-timer." He drew a revolver, the steel glinting in the fading light. The standoff had begun, the air thick with tension, the silence broken only by the murmur of the river and the snorting of the horses. Hawkins' cruel grin mirrored the darkness Caleb had spent a lifetime trying to bury. "Hawkins," Caleb rasped, the name like gravel on his tongue. "You mistake me for a fool. This ain't about no debt, nor questioning. This is about something uglier." Hawkins' grin faltered, replaced by a flicker of something less assured. "You presume too much, old man. These girls are wards of the territory. They're needed for questioning regarding a missing payroll." Caleb spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt. "Payroll? These are children. They've seen more darkness than you'll ever know, Hawkins. But thieves they ain't. Don't make me spell it out for you. Their village was raided. They were there. They might have information." Hawkins' voice hardened, losing its veneer of civility. "Now step aside." Caleb remained rooted, his gaze unwavering. He saw the lie in Hawkins' eyes, the desperation masked by a cruel facade. He knew the stories these men told themselves to justify their actions. He had heard them before, whispered in saloons and shouted from gallows. "What did they see, Hawkins?" Caleb pressed, his voice dangerously low. "What really happened in that village? Why are you so eager to find them?" Hawkins' face flushed with anger. "That's none of your concern." He raised his revolver, the barrel pointed directly at Caleb's chest. "I'm done talking. Move aside, or I'll put you in the ground, alongside your doubts." Caleb didn't flinch. He knew this wasn't just about the girls. Not anymore. It was about something buried deep within Hawkins, a darkness that mirrored his own, a darkness he had vowed to keep from spreading. "This land," Caleb said, his voice resonating with a quiet authority, "it demands a price for every drop of blood spilled, every lie whispered. You think you can take what you want without consequence? You're wrong." He shifted his weight, his rifle rising slightly. He didn't want to kill these men, but he would, if he had to. He owed it to Estella and Luna. He owed it to the memory of his own lost family. He owed it to the land itself, a land that had already seen too much suffering. "You have a choice, Hawkins," Caleb said, his eyes locking with the man's. "Turn around. Right away. Leave these girls in peace. Or face the consequences." The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the weight of his words, a promise of protection, etched in the stark beauty of the West. The moral battle was drawn, a silent showdown, under the watchful gaze of the ancient rocks. Hawkins sneered, a guttural sound that echoed in the tense silence. "Consequences? You think you can threaten me, old man? You're standing on borrowed time." He squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, shattering the stillness. Caleb reacted instantly, dropping to one knee and firing his rifle. The bullet whizzed past Hawkins's head, kicking up dust behind him. Hawkins stumbled back, surprised by Caleb's speed and accuracy. The other riders opened fire, bullets ripping through the air. Caleb returned fire, using the rocks for cover, his movements fluid and practiced. He knew he couldn't win a straight gunfight. He had to use the terrain to his advantage. "Estella! Luna! Run!" he shouted, his voice barely audible above the gunfire. "Head north. Follow the river." Estella hesitated, her eyes filled with terror. Luna, paralyzed by fear, remained huddled behind the boulder. A bullet ricocheted off the rock, sending fragments of stone flying. One of the fragments struck Luna in the arm. She cried out in pain. Caleb saw Luna fall, his heart sinking. He couldn't leave them. He had to protect them. He unleashed a furious barrage of gunfire, forcing the riders to take cover. Then he sprinted towards the girls, grabbing Luna in his arms. "Estella, go!" he yelled, pushing her forward. "Now! I'll be right behind you." Estella, tears streaming down her face, began to run, her small legs pumping furiously. Caleb, carrying Luna, followed close behind, using his body as a shield. They reached the riverbank and plunged into the water, the cold shock momentarily stealing their breath. Caleb waded through the shallows, heading north, following the course of the river. He knew they couldn't outrun Hawkins and his men. They were on horseback, and the terrain was unforgiving. He had to buy them time, give them a chance to escape. He stopped, placing Luna gently on the bank. Her arm was bleeding, but the wound didn't appear to be life-threatening. He looked at Estella, her face pale and determined. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I need you to take Luna and keep going. Follow the river. Head towards the mountains. You understand?" Estella nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "But what about you?" Caleb smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "I'll be right behind you. Just keep going. Don't stop." He knew he was lying. He wasn't going to follow them. He was going to draw Hawkins and his men away, give the girls a chance to escape. He was going to sacrifice himself. He took a deep breath, accepting his fate. He had lived a long and hard life. He had seen too much death and destruction. But he had also known love and kindness. He had found a moment of peace in the company of these two orphaned girls. He stood up, his rifle in his hand. "Go," he said, his voice firm. "Now." Estella, tears streaming down her face, took Luna's hand and began to run, following the riverbank. Caleb watched them go, his heart filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. Then he turned back towards the clearing, his face set with grim determination. He raised his rifle, took aim, and fired. The bullet found its mark, striking one of Hawkins' men in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground. Caleb knew he had just signed his own death warrant, but he didn't care. He had given the girls a chance. He had done what he had to do. He was done. Estella, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, didn't stop. She pulled Luna along, the younger girl stumbling, her injured arm a dead weight. The echo of the gunshot still rang in her ears, a terrifying symphony of loss and desperate hope. Caleb. He was staying behind to protect them, a man who barely spoke, yet offered everything. She glanced back once, a quick, furtive movement. She saw Caleb standing in the clearing, a lone figure silhouetted against the setting sun, exchanging gunfire with Hawkins and his men. Then she forced herself to look away. Looking back wouldn't help Caleb. Only getting Luna to safety would. The river was their guide, its cold current a numbing presence against their legs. Estella remembered the stories her grandmother used to tell, tales of survival in the harsh desert. Find water, find shelter, find a way. Her grandmother was gone now, another casualty of the brutal West, but her lessons remained, etched in Estella's memory. She pulled Luna behind a thicket of willows, their branches providing a meager screen. "We need to stop the bleeding," Estella said, her voice trembling but firm. She tore a strip of cloth from Luna's dress and tied it tightly around the wound. "Hold this," she instructed. "Press hard." Luna, her face pale and drawn, obeyed without question. Estella scanned their surroundings, her eyes searching for any sign of danger. The riders would be after them soon, she knew. They had to find a better hiding place. She remembered a small cave she had discovered while foraging for berries, a narrow opening hidden behind a waterfall. It was a long shot, but it was their only chance. "Can you walk?" she asked Luna. Luna nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain. "I can try." They continued along the riverbank, their progress slow and arduous. Estella supported Luna, her small frame straining under the weight. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows across the landscape. Finally, they reached the waterfall. The roar of the water was deafening, but Estella knew the cave was nearby. She led Luna behind the cascading water, the spray soaking them to the bone. There it was, the narrow opening, almost invisible behind the curtain of water. Estella squeezed through, pulling Luna after her. The cave was small and damp, but it offered a degree of protection. "We'll be safe here," Estella whispered, her voice hoarse. "For now." She knew Hawkins wouldn't give up easily. He would search for them, relentlessly. But Estella had a secret weapon, a knowledge of the land that he didn't possess. She had spent her life learning the ways of the desert, the hidden paths, the secret springs. She would use that knowledge to survive. She would honor Caleb's sacrifice by keeping Luna safe. She would not let the darkness consume them. The spirit of the silent rancher had ignited something within her, a spark of resilience that refused to be extinguished. The tables, perhaps, were about to turn. The hours crawled by, marked only by the rhythmic roar of the waterfall and the gnawing ache in Luna's arm. Estella, despite her fatigue, remained vigilant. She couldn't shake the feeling that Hawkins was close. She could almost smell his desperation, the scent of greed and entitlement that clung to him like dust. She had a plan, a dangerous one, born from necessity and fueled by a burning desire for retribution. She would use Hawkins's own arrogance against him. She would lure him into the canyons, a labyrinth of rock and shadow, where she held the advantage. As dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Estella slipped out of the cave. She left Luna with a canteen of water and a handful of dried berries. "Stay here," she instructed, "no matter what you hear, no matter what happens." Luna, her eyes filled with fear, nodded silently. Estella kissed her forehead and disappeared behind the waterfall. She moved swiftly and silently, a shadow among the rocks. She knew the canyons intimately, every crevice, every hidden path. She knew where the loose stones lay, where the echoes amplified, where the sun blinded. She found tracks easily enough. Hawkins and his men hadn't bothered to conceal their passage. They were confident, arrogant. They believed they were hunting down two helpless girls. They were wrong. Estella deliberately left a few clues, a broken twig, a discarded scrap of cloth, breadcrumbs for the wolf. She led them deeper and deeper into the canyons, towards a narrow gorge she knew well. The walls were sheer and unforgiving, the only path a treacherous ledge that wound along the cliff face. A perfect kill zone. She waited, hidden behind a cluster of boulders, her heart pounding in her chest. The sun climbed higher, baking the rocks, turning the canyon into an oven. Finally she heard them, the clatter of hooves on stone, the gruff voices of men. Hawkins was in the lead, his face flushed with anger and anticipation. He spotted the scrap of cloth Estella had left behind and grinned. "Almost got him," he muttered. Estella took a deep breath, steeling herself. It was time. She stepped out from behind the boulders, her small frame silhouetted against the sun. "Hawkins!" she called out, her voice surprisingly strong. Hawkins reined in his horse, his eyes widening in surprise. "Well, well," he said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Look what we have here. The little lamb, all alone." "Leave Luna alone," Estella said, her voice unwavering. Hawkins laughed. "And why would I do that? She knows too much. Besides," he added, his eyes gleaming with a predatory light, "I think I'll enjoy breaking you both." Estella didn't flinch. She had anticipated this. "You won't get away with this, Hawkins," she said. "Caleb is watching." Hawkins scoffed. "That old fool. He's probably worm food by now. And even if he wasn't, what's he going to do? He's just one man." "This land remembers," Estella said, her voice low and menacing. "It remembers every drop of blood spilled, every injustice committed, and it always demands its due." She took a step back towards the narrow ledge. "Come and get me, Hawkins," she taunted. "If you dare." Hawkins, blinded by rage and greed, took the bait. He spurred his horse forward, ignoring the treacherous terrain. His men followed close behind, their revolvers drawn. Estella turned and ran, her bare feet finding purchase on the narrow ledge. She knew every inch of this path, every loose footing. Hawkins, on horseback, was less sure. His horse, sensing the danger, whinnied nervously, its hooves slipping on the loose stones. Estella reached a particularly treacherous section of the ledge, a sharp turn with a steep drop-off. She knew this was her moment. She stopped, turned, and faced Hawkins, her eyes blazing with defiance. "This is as far as you go, Hawkins," she said. Hawkins, his face contorted with rage, raised his revolver. "You little—" Before he could finish the sentence, Estella kicked a pile of loose stones over the edge. The stones cascaded down the cliff face, striking Hawkins' horse in the legs. The horse reared up in panic, throwing Hawkins from the saddle. Hawkins landed hard on the ledge, his revolver flying from his hand. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with terror. He looked down at the dizzying drop below. "Estella, please," he cried, his voice cracking with fear. "Don't do this." Estella didn't answer. She simply stared at him, her face devoid of emotion. She had seen too much death, too much suffering. She had lost too much. She felt no pity for Hawkins. He had made his choice. He took a step towards her, his hands outstretched. "I'll give you anything. Money. Land. Just let me live." Estella remained silent. She knew that even if she spared him, he would never change. He would continue to prey on the weak, to exploit the vulnerable. He was a cancer on the land, and he needed to be removed. Hawkins took another step, his foot slipping on the loose stones. He flailed his arms, trying to regain his balance, but it was too late. He lost his footing and tumbled over the edge, his screams echoing through the canyon. Estella watched as he fell, her heart pounding in her chest. When the screams finally stopped, she turned and walked away, her face set with grim determination. Back in the cave, Luna huddled in the darkness, her injured arm throbbing with pain. She had heard the gunshots, the shouts, the screams. She knew that Estella had gone to confront Hawkins. She prayed that she was safe. She thought of Caleb, his silent strength, his unexpected kindness. She remembered the stories he used to tell, tales of bravery and resilience, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. She had never understood why he had taken them in, two orphaned girls with nothing to offer. Now she knew. He had seen something in them, a spark of hope that he wanted to nurture. He had given them a home, a family, and he had given his life to protect them. Tears streamed down Luna's face, a mixture of grief and gratitude. She would never forget Caleb. She would carry his memory with her always. She would honor his sacrifice by living a life of courage and compassion. She would be the kind of person he believed she could be, the kind of person Estella was. They were more than orphans now. They were survivors. Estella found Luna just as she'd left her, huddled in the damp cave, her face streaked with tears. Relief washed over Estella, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She knelt beside Luna, pulling her close. "It's over," she whispered, her voice raw. "It's done." Luna clung to Estella, her small body trembling. What happened?" Estella held her tighter, unwilling to recount the details. "He won't hurt us anymore," she said simply. "He can't." They stayed in the cave for a while longer, drawing strength from each other's presence. As the sun climbed higher, Estella knew they couldn't stay there forever. They had to find a place to bury Caleb, a place where he could rest in peace. She helped Luna to her feet, supporting her as they emerged from the cave. The world outside seemed brighter, cleaner, somehow, now that the darkness had been lifted. They walked in silence, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the canyon. Estella led Luna towards a high mesa, a flat-topped mountain that overlooked the vast landscape. Caleb had loved this place. He used to come here to watch the sunrise, to find solace in the immensity of the desert. The climb was arduous, especially for Luna with her injured arm. But they persevered, driven by a shared sense of purpose. Finally, they reached the summit. The view was breathtaking. The desert stretched out before them, an endless expanse of red rock and scrub brush. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of sage and dust. Estella found a sheltered spot near the edge of the mesa, a place where the sun would shine on Caleb's grave. She began to dig, her hands raw and bleeding. Luna, despite her injury, helped as much as she could, using a piece of broken pottery to scoop out the earth. It took them hours, but finally they had a shallow grave. Estella wrapped Caleb's body in a worn blanket, a blanket he had used to keep them warm on cold nights. Together, they lowered him into the ground. Estella closed her eyes, remembering Caleb's quiet strength, his unwavering loyalty. He had been a good man, a decent man, in a world that often seemed devoid of both. When she opened her eyes, she saw Luna placing a small, smooth stone on Caleb's chest. Estella smiled a sad, tender smile. She picked up another stone, a larger one, and placed it on top of the first, then another and another, until Caleb's grave was covered in a cairn of stones, a testament to his courage, his kindness, his enduring spirit. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the mesa. Estella and Luna stood in silence, watching the colors fade from the sky. They knew that Caleb was gone, but his memory would live on, a beacon of hope in the vast, unforgiving landscape. They were alone, but not broken. They were survivors, bound together by loss, strengthened by resilience, forever marked by the silent rancher who had changed their lives. The first stars pricked the darkening sky as Estella and Luna descended the mesa. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of piñon and the promise of a long night. They walked hand in hand, their silence a comfortable understanding, a shared grief that needed no words. They couldn't stay. Not here, not with the memory of Caleb so raw, so present in every gust of wind that swept across the plains. They needed to find a new place, a new beginning, somewhere far from the canyons, far from the ghost of Hawkins and the bitter taste of injustice. They walked for 2 days, following the faint trace of a forgotten wagon trail. Luna's arm, though still tender, grew stronger with each step. Estella kept a watchful eye, scanning the horizon for danger, her senses honed by the recent trauma. They foraged for berries and roots, sharing what little they found. At night they huddled together for warmth, finding solace in each other's presence. On the 3rd day, they saw it, a plume of smoke rising in the distance. Hope flickered within them, fragile but persistent. They quickened their pace, their hearts pounding with anticipation. As they drew closer, they saw a small homestead, a cluster of weathered buildings nestled in a sheltered valley. A wisp of smoke curled from the chimney of a small cabin, promising warmth and sustenance. A woman, her face etched with hardship, stood in the doorway watching them approach. She was tall and lean, with eyes that were both weary and kind. Her name was Sarah, and she had lost her husband to a fever just months before. She lived alone, tending to her small farm, struggling to make ends meet. Estella and Luna approached cautiously, unsure of how they would be received, but Sarah welcomed them with open arms. offering them food and shelter. She listened patiently to their story, her eyes filled with compassion. She didn't pry, didn't judge. She simply offered them a place to rest, a chance to heal. In the days that followed, Estella and Luna helped Sarah with her chores, tending to the animals, weeding the garden, mending fences. They learned to trust again, to open their hearts to the possibility of kindness. Sarah, in turn, found solace in their company, a renewed sense of purpose in caring for them. They spoke often of Caleb, sharing stories of his gentle spirit, his unwavering integrity. They vowed to honor his memory by living lives of courage and compassion, by standing up for the weak and the vulnerable. They would be his legacy, a testament to the power of kindness in a world filled with cruelty. The wind still whispered through the canyons, carrying tales of loss and resilience. But now, the whispers were mingled with a new melody, a song of hope, a promise of a brighter future. Luna, looking towards the setting sun, felt a warmth spread through her, a sense that Caleb was watching over them, guiding them towards a new beginning. They were scarred, but not broken. They were survivors, bound together by loss, strengthened by resilience, ready to face whatever the future held. Weeks turned into months. Estella and Luna found a rhythm in the hard scrabble life on Sarah's farm. The sun rose, the chores began, the sun set, and they slept. The cycle was simple, demanding, and strangely healing. Luna, with renewed vigor, tended to the chickens and learned to milk the cow, her injured arm growing stronger with each passing day. Estella, always watchful, took on the heavier tasks, repairing fences, chopping wood, and keeping a wary eye on the horizon. Sarah taught them the secrets of the land, how to coax life from the parched soil, how to read the signs of the changing seasons. She shared her knowledge of medicinal herbs, showing them how to heal wounds and soothe aches with the gifts of the earth. She was a quiet woman, but her wisdom ran deep, rooted in years of hardship and resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Estella sat on the porch, mending a tear in her worn leather gloves. Luna sat beside her, humming a tuneless melody as she braided Sarah's hair. A sense of peace settled over them, a fragile tranquility that felt both precious and precarious. Estella looked out at the vast expanse of the plains, her gaze drawn to the distant mountains. She thought of Caleb, his gentle smile, his unwavering faith in them. She wondered if he could see them now, if he knew that they were safe, that they were healing. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, a silhouette against the fiery sky. Estella tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the knife she always carried at her hip. Luna stopped humming, her eyes wide with apprehension. As the rider drew closer, they recognized the familiar figure. It was the silent rancher, the man who had given them a chance to escape, the man who had changed their lives forever. He rode up to the porch, dismounted, and stood before them, his face weathered and unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't smile. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of their presence. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, worn book. He handed it to Estella, his eyes meeting hers for a brief moment. It was a book of poetry, the same book that Caleb had used to read to them on cold winter nights. Estella took the book, her fingers trembling. She looked up at the silent rancher, her heart filled with gratitude. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she knew that He was a good man, a man who had acted with courage and compassion in a world filled with darkness. He turned and remounted his horse, his silhouette framed against the setting sun. He rode off into the distance, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. Estella watched him go, her heart filled with a sense of awe. She knew that she would never forget him, that his act of kindness would stay with her forever. She looked down at the book in her hands, a symbol of hope, a reminder that, even in the face of unspeakable cruelty, mercy and sacrifice could sow the seeds of a new beginning. The sun dipped fully below the horizon, leaving only the faintest glimmer of light on the distant plains. The west was a harsh place, unforgiving and wild. But it was also a place where unexpected acts of kindness could bloom, where hope could take root in the most desolate soil. And sometimes that was enough.